You know that feeling when you're watching a Netflix show, or scrolling through social media, or reading a news article, and something feels off? Not wrong in a way you can immediately articulate. Not obviously false, but manipulative, emotionally coercive. Like you're being pushed toward a conclusion rather than invited to think. You feel it in your gut, but when you try to explain it to someone else, the words fail you. It just feels like propaganda, you say, and they respond. But where's the lie? What specifically is false? And you can't quite answer. Here's the impossible question. If you can't identify the specific manipulation, are you just being paranoid? Or is there a kind of propaganda so sophisticated that it works precisely by being difficult to name? Roger Scruton spent 50 years answering that question, not as a political pundit ranting about media bias, as a philosopher who understood something most people miss. The most effective propaganda doesn't lie about facts. It manipulates how you feel about truth itself. Scruton saw this firsthand during the 1980s. He traveled secretly into communist Czechoslovakia and Poland, teaching philosophy to dissidents who risked imprisonment just to think freely. He watched how totalitarian regimes control populations not primarily through lies, but through emotional manipulation, aesthetic degradation, and the systematic destruction of the language needed to articulate truth. When he returned to the West, he recognized the same patterns, not in government censorship, but in cultural institutions that claimed to champion freedom. The techniques were subtler, the goals different, but the mechanism identical. Control how people feel, and you control how they think. What you're experiencing when that Netflix show feels manipulative isn't paranoia, it's recognition. You're detecting a specific kind of ideological technique that Scruton spent his life analyzing and exposing. You just don't have the vocabulary to name what you're seeing. That changes today. You're not imagining things. That instinct that something is emotionally coercive in modern media. That's your mind detecting real patterns of manipulation. The problem isn't your perception. It's that we've lost a philosophical language to articulate what we're experiencing. Scruton gives us that language back. He identified 5 specific techniques of ideological propaganda that work not through explicit lies, but through emotional manipulation, aesthetic degradation, and linguistic corruption. These techniques are everywhere in woke media. Once you learn to see them, you can't unsee them. This isn't about getting angry at propaganda. It's about developing the philosophical clarity to recognize it, name it, and immunize yourself against it. By the end of this episode, you'll have a practical diagnostic framework, the Scruton method, that transforms vague discomfort into precise recognition. If you want to discover more about how great thinkers illuminate modern cultural struggles, subscribe to this channel where we explore the wisdom of philosophers who refuse to surrender to fashionable thinking. Now, to understand how Scruton developed this extraordinary framework, we need to begin with a foundational insight that changed everything for him. Let me start with the story that changed how Scruton understood propaganda forever. It's 1985. Scruton is in a basement in Prague, teaching Plato to a group of Czech dissidents. The communist regime has banned private teaching, so they meet in secret, rotating locations, always at risk. One student, a factory worker who reads philosophy hidden under his workbench, asks Scruton a question: how do they make us complicit in our own oppression? Notice that question. Not how they force us to obey, but how do they make us complicit? This worker understood something profound. The most effective control isn't imposed by external force. It's internalized through emotional manipulation. Scruton spent the next week observing communist propaganda with new eyes. He noticed something astonishing. The regime's propaganda almost never lied about verifiable facts. When they did lie outright, everyone knew it and simply ignored it. The propaganda that actually worked, that shaped how people thought and felt, operated at a different level entirely. It worked through what Scruton called sentimental corruption. The regime didn't tell people what to think about specific policies. It taught them how to feel about questioning itself. Doubt became bourgeois anxiety. Independent thinking became antisocial individualism. The desire for beauty became decadent escapism. You know what's brilliant about this? The regime never had to defend specific claims. They controlled emotional associations around the very act of critical thinking. Here's where this gets relevant to you. When you watch that Netflix show and feel manipulated, you're often detecting this exact technique. The show isn't lying about facts. It's manipulating your emotional associations with questioning itself. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how woke media doesn't just present a position? It makes you feel morally defective for even considering alternatives? That's not argument. That's sentimental corruption. They're not trying to convince your reason. They're trying to capture your emotions, so reason never gets a chance to operate. Scruton saw that totalitarian propaganda and woke propaganda share a crucial feature. Both work by making dissent feel emotionally impossible before it becomes intellectually articulable. You don't reject a correct position because you've examined and found it wanting. You can't even examine it because doubt itself has been coded as moral failure. This is why you struggle to explain what feels wrong. You're trying to identify false claims, but the manipulation isn't happening at the level of claims. It's happening at the level of emotional permission to think critically. Scruton discovered that effective propaganda has 5 specific techniques that operate at this emotional level, beneath explicit argument. These techniques don't replace lies. They make lies unnecessary. They create an emotional environment where truth becomes literally unthinkable. Wait until you see what these 5 techniques are. You'll recognize every single one from media you consumed this week. But first, you need to understand the philosophical foundation that makes the Scruton method so powerful. Because Scruton wasn't just observing propaganda techniques. He was operating from a deep philosophical understanding of how emotion, reason, and truth actually relate to each other, and understanding that modern ideologues deliberately invert. Here's what makes Scruton's analysis of propaganda so devastating. He understood that emotion and reason aren't enemies. They're partners in recognizing truth. This is crucial. Most conservatives make a fatal mistake when analyzing woke propaganda. They say, ignore emotion, just focus on facts and logic. But Scruton saw that this concedes too much. It accepts the propagandist's false dichotomy between emotion and truth. Scruton argued the opposite. He said, authentic emotion is how we first recognize truth. When you see genuine beauty, you feel it before you can articulate why. When you encounter real injustice, you feel moral revulsion before you've analyzed the ethical principles involved. When someone speaks a deep truth, you feel its resonance before you verified its logical structure. Emotion isn't the enemy of truth. Emotion is truth's first ambassador. But, and this is everything, emotion can also be truth's most effective deceiver. Because the same mechanism that lets authentic emotion recognize truth can be hijacked to make lies feel true. Think about how this works in practice. You're watching a documentary about social justice. There's stirring music, close-ups of tearful faces, dramatic editing, statistics presented with emotional urgency. You feel moved. You feel that you're witnessing truth. But wait, are you feeling truth or are you feeling manipulation? How do you tell the difference? This is exactly what Scruton spent years analyzing. He identified the crucial distinction between authentic emotion and sentimental manipulation. Listen carefully, because this is the key to the entire method. Authentic emotion deepens your perception of reality. It makes you see more clearly. It opens you to complexity and nuance. It creates what Scruton called cognitive contact with the actual truth of a situation. Sentimental manipulation does the opposite. It simplifies reality into emotional cartoons. It closes you off from complexity. It severs your cognitive contact with truth and replaces it with feeling good about feeling the correct emotions. Let me give you a concrete example. You see footage of a homeless person. Authentic compassion makes you recognize the complex reality of that person's situation, the economic factors, the personal choices, the systemic issues, the individual dignity, the policy trade-offs. It's painful and complicated. Sentimental manipulation gives you the emotional satisfaction of compassion without the cognitive burden of complexity. It presents homelessness as a simple morality play. Villains, capitalism, conservatives, the wealthy, and victims, the homeless. You get to feel compassionate without actually thinking about difficult realities. You know what Scruton called this? Emotional kitsch. Just like kitsch art gives you the feeling of beauty, without actually being beautiful, emotional kitsch gives you the feeling of moral insight without actually requiring moral thought. This is why woke propaganda is so effective with educated people. It's not crude, it's sophisticated kitsch. It delivers complex-sounding ideas, academic vocabulary, emotional intensity, and moral satisfaction. It feels like you're engaging with difficult truths, but you're actually being protected from difficult truths by being given emotionally satisfying substitutes. Notice how brilliant this is as a propaganda technique. It makes people feel like critical thinkers while preventing actual critical thinking. You're not being told to stop thinking. You're being given a pseudo-thinking that feels like the real thing, but leads only where the propagandist wants you to go. Scruton saw this in communist propaganda. Every regime claimed to champion critical consciousness and questioning assumptions, but the criticism was always pre-directed toward approved targets. The questioning was always scripted to arrive at predetermined conclusions. Sound familiar? Woke institutions constantly invoke critical thinking and interrogating assumptions, but only specific assumptions get interrogated, always arriving at the same ideological conclusions. Here's the philosophical principle that underlies the entire Scruton method. Real thinking is recognized not by emotional intensity or complex vocabulary, but by whether it genuinely opens reality to view or cleverly closes reality from view while maintaining the feeling of enlightenment. Now we're ready for the actual method. 5 specific techniques you can identify in any piece of media to determine whether it's genuine thinking or sophisticated propaganda. All right, here's the practical framework. Scruton identified 5 specific techniques that woke propaganda uses to manipulate emotion while claiming to present truth. I'm going to give you each technique with a concrete diagnostic question you can ask. The first technique is sentimental blackmail. This is when media makes questioning a position feel like moral failure. The content isn't arguing that X is true. It's constructing an emotional environment where doubting X makes you feel like a bad person. The diagnostic question is, am I being given reasons to believe this, or am I being made to feel defective for doubting? For example, a documentary about gender ideology doesn't present evidence for its claims. It shows tearful testimonies, implies that questioning causes suicide, uses language like denying someone's existence. You're not convinced by argument. You're emotionally blackmailed into silence. Scruton saw this constantly in communist propaganda. Dissent wasn't refuted. It was pathologized as antisocial anxiety or bourgeois individualism. Woke propaganda uses the same technique. Disagreement isn't wrong. It's phobic, violent, or harmful. The second technique is aesthetic degradation. This is when propaganda deliberately uses ugliness to break down your aesthetic judgment, which Scruton knew was connected to your moral and rational judgment. The diagnostic question is, does this media treat beauty, order, and form with respect, or does it celebrate ugliness and chaos as authenticity? For example, modern activist art that's deliberately ugly, incomprehensible, or shocking. The message isn't in the content. It's in the form itself. By breaking down your natural human preference for beauty, order, and meaning, it breaks down your ability to recognize truth, goodness, and reality. Scruton understood that totalitarian regimes always attack beauty first. Brutalist architecture, avant-garde people's art. Why? Because people with degraded aesthetic sensibility lose the ability to recognize truth in any domain. The third technique is language corruption. This is when propaganda changes the meaning of words to make certain thoughts literally impossible to express. The diagnostic question is, are words being used to illuminate reality or to obscure it behind emotional associations? For example, diversity no longer means variety of perspectives. It means ideological uniformity. Inclusion doesn't mean welcoming everyone. It means excluding dissenters. Safety doesn't mean physical protection. It means emotional comfort from ideas you dislike. If this framework is transforming how you see media you consumed this week, hit like so more people can develop the same clarity, and comment with an example of propaganda you now recognize using these techniques. Scruton watched Orwell's Newspeak become reality in communist countries. The regime didn't ban criticism. They made criticism inexpressible by corrupting the very words you need to articulate it. Woke ideology does exactly this with systematic language transformation. The fourth technique is false moral equivalence. This is when propaganda presents a completely distorted moral landscape where genuine virtues and vices are inverted or equated. The diagnostic question is, does this media present a moral hierarchy I recognize from lived reality, or an inverted hierarchy that serves ideological goals? For example, media that presents parents wanting to protect children from sexual content as equivalent to, or worse than, activists wanting to expose children to that content. The normal protective instinct is bigotry. The violation of innocence is education. Scruton identified this in communist propaganda's inversion of virtue. Self-sacrifice for the state was heroism. Sacrifice for family was selfishness. Individual excellence was bourgeois decadence. Collective mediocrity was socialist virtue. The fifth technique is manufactured transcendence. This is when propaganda offers pseudo-religious meaning and purpose as a substitute for actual transcendence. The diagnostic question is, does this invite me towards something genuinely greater than myself, or does it just make me feel I'm part of something greater while actually serving ideological power? For example, the quasi-religious fervor woke movements, confessions of privilege, ritual denunciations, absolute moral certainty, excommunication of heretics. It gives the emotional satisfaction of religious meaning without any actual transcendence beyond political power. These 5 techniques work together to create an emotional environment where propaganda doesn't need to lie. It just needs to manipulate how you feel about truth itself. Now, let's apply the method to concrete examples you've actually encountered. I want you to see how quickly this framework transforms vague discomfort into precise recognition. Consider a typical corporate diversity training video. Watch through the Scruton lens. You immediately detect sentimental blackmail. The content doesn't argue that unconscious bias exists or that their solutions work. It makes you feel that questioning would reveal your own bias. Doubt itself becomes evidence of guilt. You notice aesthetic degradation. Notice the visual design, usually aggressively contemporary, sometimes deliberately ugly or chaotic. This isn't accidental. It's breaking down your aesthetic judgment to make you more receptive to ideological claims. You detect language corruption. Bias no longer means prejudice. It means any preference or pattern recognition. Equity doesn't mean fairness. It means equal outcomes regardless of merit. Harm doesn't mean injury. It means emotional discomfort with ideas. You see false moral equivalence. Treating people identically regardless of race is presented as morally equivalent to, or worse than, racial discrimination. The content has completely inverted the moral hierarchy, and you recognize manufactured transcendence. The training offers pseudo-religious meaning, confession, acknowledging privilege, absolution through ideological compliance, belonging to the enlightened, and purpose, creating equity. It's a substitute religion. You see, the manipulation isn't in any single false claim. It's in these 5 interconnected techniques operating simultaneously to create an emotional environment where critical thinking becomes psychologically impossible. Now, consider a Netflix documentary on social justice. Apply the framework again. The documentary uses stirring music, emotional testimonies, and dramatic editing, sentimental blackmail. You're made to feel heartless for analyzing critically. It features ugly or chaotic imagery presented as authentic, aesthetic degradation. It systematically redefines terms like justice, equality, and oppression, language corruption. It presents complex social issues as simple good versus evil narratives with inverted heroes and villains, false moral equivalence. And it offers viewers a sense that they're part of a righteous movement transforming history, manufactured transcendence. None of this requires lying about specific facts. The manipulation happens at the emotional and aesthetic level, beneath fact-checking. Here's what makes the Scruton method so powerful. Once you've identified these 5 techniques, you can instantly distinguish between genuine documentary and propaganda, even when both present themselves as educational. A genuine documentary invites complexity, uses beauty in order to illuminate truth, employs language precisely, maintains recognizable moral hierarchy from reality, and points toward truth beyond ideological utility. You feel your understanding deepened. Propaganda does the opposite on all 5 dimensions, and you feel emotionally satisfied but intellectually closed. Let me give you a real-world test. Think about the last piece of media that made you feel simultaneously moved and manipulated. Now run it through the 5 techniques. Were you given reasons or made to feel bad for doubting? Did the aesthetics illuminate or degrade? Were words used clearly or corrupted? Was the moral hierarchy recognizable from reality or ideologically inverted? Did it point beyond ideology or offer ideology as transcendence? If you answer the second option to most of these, you were experiencing propaganda, regardless of whether any individual fact was false. You know what's extraordinary? Scruton developed this framework not in response to woke ideology. He died before its current dominance, but from analyzing totalitarian propaganda 50 years ago. The fact that it maps perfectly onto woke media reveals something crucial. We're not dealing with a new phenomenon. We're dealing with an old ideological technique in contemporary form. The propagandists think they've invented something novel. Scruton shows us they're just repeating a pattern he spent his life exposing. Now, for the most important part, how do you immunize yourself against these techniques? Because recognition is only half the battle. You can identify propaganda and still find yourself emotionally affected by it. Scruton understood that resistance requires more than intellectual knowledge. It requires cultivating specific habits and dispositions. The first practice is to cultivate authentic aesthetic experience. This is Scruton's most counterintuitive insight. Your defense against propaganda is beauty. Why? Because genuine beauty trains your emotional and perceptual capacities to recognize truth. When you regularly experience authentic beauty, in nature, classical architecture, great art, fine craftsmanship, you develop an immune response to kitsch and manipulation. Practically, spend time with beautiful things. Not nice things or expensive things, but genuinely beautiful things. A well-designed building, a perfect sentence in a great novel, a landscape where human and natural order harmonize, a piece of music with real complexity and resolution. Your aesthetic sense is like a muscle. The more you exercise it on genuine beauty, the more quickly you detect aesthetic manipulation. The second practice is to read primary sources. Woke propaganda depends on you never actually reading what great thinkers said. It requires you to accept mediated, corrupted versions. When a documentary tells you what science says or what experts agree or how history shows, your immunity is to ask, what do the scientists actually write? What do experts who disagree say? What do primary historical sources reveal? Scruton's dissidents in Eastern Europe built resistance precisely this way. The regime told them what Plato said. They read Plato. The discrepancy was devastating. They could never be manipulated the same way again. The third practice is to defend precise language. When someone uses a word in a corrupted way, don't let it pass. Gently but firmly insist on precision. When you say harm, do you mean physical injury or do you mean emotional discomfort with ideas you dislike? When you say diversity, do you mean demographic variation or ideological uniformity? This isn't pedantry. It's defending the precondition for rational thought. When language is corrupted, thinking becomes impossible. The fourth practice is to maintain moral clarity. Resist false equivalences by staying grounded in lived moral reality. You know from actual experience that protecting children is good, that honesty is virtuous, that beauty enriches life, that truth matters more than comfort. When propaganda presents an inverted moral hierarchy, you have a choice. Accept the inversion and lose contact with reality, or maintain your moral clarity and resist the manipulation. Scruton's advice: trust your moral experience more than ideological theory. When theory contradicts what you know from living, the theory is wrong. The fifth practice is to seek genuine transcendence. The manufactured transcendence of woke ideology works because humans genuinely need meaning beyond themselves. If you have no source of real transcendence, whether religious faith, philosophical truth, artistic creation, or connection to nature and tradition, you'll be vulnerable to pseudo-transcendence. Scruton's own life modeled this. He found transcendence in beauty. In religious faith, he converted to Anglicanism later in life, in philosophical truth, and in defending his culture. These genuine sources of meaning made him immune to ideological substitutes. Here's what this all adds up to. You defeat propaganda not primarily through better arguments, but through becoming the kind of person propaganda can't capture. A person with cultivated aesthetic judgment detects sentimental manipulation. A person who reads primary sources can't be lied to about what they say. A person who defends language can't have thoughts made impossible. A person grounded in moral reality can't be sold inverted hierarchies. A person with genuine transcendence doesn't need manufactured meaning. Scruton called this living in truth. Václav Havel's phrase for how Czech dissidents resisted totalitarianism. They couldn't overthrow the regime, but they could refuse to let the regime colonize their minds and souls. You face the same choice in a different context. You can't single-handedly overthrow woke institutional power, but you can become immune to its propaganda by cultivating the habits and dispositions that make you unavailable for manipulation. That's what the Scruton method ultimately offers. Not just a diagnostic framework, but a way of living that propaganda cannot penetrate. Now you see propaganda differently. That vague discomfort you felt watching certain Netflix shows, reading certain articles, sitting through corporate training, you can name it now. You're not paranoid. You're not oversensitive. You are detecting real patterns of emotional manipulation operating beneath explicit argument. The Scruton method gave you the vocabulary you needed: sentimental blackmail, aesthetic degradation, language corruption, false moral equivalence, manufactured transcendence. 5 techniques you can now identify instantly. 5 ways propaganda works not by lying about facts, but by manipulating how you feel about truth itself. But more importantly, you understand now why this matters so deeply. Scruton spent years with dissidents who risked everything just to think freely. He watched how totalitarian propaganda didn't just control behavior. It attempted to colonize the human soul, to make independent thought literally impossible by corrupting the emotional, aesthetic, and linguistic preconditions for thinking. When you apply the Scruton method, you're not just protecting yourself from being fooled. You're defending your capacity for independent thought itself. You're refusing to let propagandists determine how you feel, what you notice, how you speak, what you value, or where you find meaning. That factory worker in Prague asked Scruton, "How do they make us complicit in our own oppression?" The answer is, by capturing your emotions so reason never gets a chance, by degrading your aesthetic sense so you can't recognize truth, by corrupting your language so you can't articulate dissent, by inverting your moral hierarchy so you can't trust your own judgment, by offering fake transcendence so you don't seek real meaning. The Scruton method breaks that mechanism. It doesn't make you immune to being wrong. Scruton will be the first to say we're all wrong about many things. But it makes you immune to the specific techniques of ideological manipulation that bypass your rational faculties entirely. You're no longer vulnerable to propaganda that works through emotional coercion rather than argument. You can spot sentimental blackmail the moment someone tries it. You recognize aesthetic degradation as a tool of control. You defend your language against corruption. You maintain moral clarity against false equivalence. You seek genuine transcendence instead of ideological substitutes. This is what Scruton meant by living in truth, not claiming to possess all truth, but refusing to participate in lies, especially lies so sophisticated they operate beneath the level of explicit claims. Starting immediately, apply the Scruton method to everything you consume. Don't wait for obviously propagandistic content. Test everything: news articles, documentaries, corporate communications, entertainment, academic lectures, social media posts. For the next week, keep a simple journal. Each time you consume media, ask yourself the 5 diagnostic questions. Am I being given reasons or made to feel defective for doubting? Does this use beauty to illuminate truth or ugliness to degrade judgment? Are words employed precisely or corrupted ideologically? Is the moral hierarchy recognizable from reality or ideologically inverted? Does this point toward genuine transcendence or offer ideology as substitute religion? You'll be shocked how often content you previously accepted as neutral or education reveals itself as sophisticated propaganda. But here's what's crucial. Don't just identify propaganda and get angry. That's not the point. The point is to become the kind of person propaganda can't capture. So alongside identifying manipulation in media, actively build resistance. Spend time with genuine beauty this week. Visit a classical building. Read poetry that has real form and meaning. Listen to music with authentic complexity. Let beauty train your perceptual capacities. Read one primary source you've only encountered through secondary interpretation. When someone uses corrupted language, gently insist on precision. Ground yourself in moral reality through lived experience, time with family, honest work, helping neighbors, creating something beautiful. Find sources of genuine transcendence, prayer, philosophical reading, artistic creation, connection with nature and tradition. These practices aren't optional extras. They're how you build immunity. Knowledge of propaganda techniques is valuable, but becoming immune to propaganda requires transformation of your whole perception, emotion, and character. Scruton didn't just teach people to recognize lies. He taught them to become the kind of people lies couldn't stick to. There's a passage from Scruton I think about constantly. Beauty is as important to the health of the soul as food is to the health of the body. In its absence, the soul sickens and dies. Do you feel the weight of that truth? Propaganda works by starving your soul, not of information, but of beauty, truth, and genuine meaning. It offers ideological kitsch as a substitute, and slowly, imperceptibly, your capacity to recognize reality atrophies. The Scruton method isn't ultimately about identifying propaganda. It's about recovering your soul's health. It's about refusing to let your aesthetic judgment be degraded, your language corrupted, your moral sense inverted, your need for transcendence exploited. Imagine your life 6 months from now after practicing this framework. You won't be perfect. Scruton never promised perfection, but you'll see clearly. When propaganda appears, you'll recognize it instantly. When someone tries sentimental blackmail, you'll feel the manipulation rather than the false guilt. When language is corrupted, you'll hear the distortion. When aesthetics are weaponized, you'll detect the degradation. And more importantly, you'll have cultivated genuine alternatives. Real beauty instead of kitsch. Precise language instead of corruption. Moral clarity instead of inversion. Authentic transcendence instead of ideological substitutes. You'll be living in truth, not perfectly, but genuinely. And that makes you dangerous to propagandists because you're unavailable for manipulation. This channel exists to discover together the wisdom of thinkers like Scruton, philosophers who defended truth when lies were fashionable, beauty when ugliness was celebrated, and freedom when conformity was demanded. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey of intellectual resistance and cultural recovery. In the next video, we'll explore Scruton's radical argument about why beauty is a human need, not a luxury. See you there. And meanwhile, may beauty guard your soul against lies.